Welcome, friends, to the online launch of Returning Southeast Asia's Past, Objects, Museums, and Restitution. This is the first book in the series Art and Architecture of Southeast Asia, Hindu-Buddhist Traditions, published by NUS Press with the Southeast Asian Art Academic Program, SOAS University of London. We're very pleased that many groups have joined NUS Press and the SOAS Southeast Asian Art Program to organize this event. Notably, joining us this evening, or this morning, this afternoon, depending where you are, is SEAMEO-SPAFA. That's the Southeast Asian Regional Center for Archaeology and Fine Arts, an international organization dedicated to promoting cooperation in education, science, and culture in Southeast Asia. And the Antiquities Coalition, an NGO which works against illicit trade in ancient art and artifacts, and the Malayan branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, a learned society dedicated to research on Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. My name is Peter Chopert. I'm the director of NUS Press, and my role is just to welcome you and to host you through this online event. The rundown is as follows. As soon as I finish, we will launch the book. Once launched, I will ask the book's editors, Louise and Panggah, to make a short presentation of the book. From there, we'll have three commentators to share their own perspectives on the book and on the issues that it raises. We'll allow some time for the responses, not only from the editors, but also from some of the contributors to the book who are joining us as well. And then we'll have some time in case you have questions from the audience. Those of you joining us on Facebook or YouTube, please put your questions in the comments and we will relay them to the folks we have with us on the video. And finally, we'll have the series editors who will reflect on the book and talk a bit more about the series. That will take us about an hour 15, probably an hour 15, 20 minutes. We'll conclude with a traditional Southeast Asian ceremony, a very important ceremony for the end of any kind of meeting, a deep tradition in the region, and by this I mean the group photo. So luckily that's something we can just about do in a virtual event, as well as a real one. Also, at the end of the event, we'll display a discount code that will give you a nice discount for the purchase of the book, either on the NUS Press website if you're in Asia, or via the University of Chicago website in the US for those of you in North America. So, the first order of business, the launch of the book. Usually, you know, at a book launch, you let loose a flock of doves or let off some fireworks. But we're in Zoom world, so we do what we can in Zoom world. We'll play a video. So here we go, the launch of Returning Southeast Asia's Past. That's it, we're launched. Terrific. Now, let me introduce and also congratulate the two editors of the book, Louise Tythacott and Panggah Ardiyansyah. Louise is the Woon Tai-ji Professor of Asian Art at Northumbria University in the UK. Her research focuses on the collecting and display of Chinese and Buddhist art in museums, and she has particular interests in issues around looting and restitution of Asian material culture. She's already published a couple of her own books on the subject, including Museums and Restitution, New Practices, New Approaches, 2014, and Collecting and Displaying China's Summer Palace in the West, the Nguyen in Britain and France in 2018. Panggah Ardiyansyah is PhD candidate in the history of art and archaeology at SOAS University of London. His main interest is in the afterlives and knowledge production around Hindu-Buddhist materials in Indonesia. And that interest brings him to read with great passion on colonial collecting practices and object restitution, as well as a historiography of modern Indonesia. Louise, Panggah, first of all, let me thank you so much for your hard work on the book. It's really most appreciated. You did a wonderful job. So let me now hand the session over to you both, Louise and Panggah.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that lovely introduction and lovely launch video. Most unexpected. So the idea for the book fundamentally came about a number of years ago as a result of a trip to Southeast Asia, a trip organised by Ashley Thompson at SOAS, organised in 2015 and funded by the Southeast Asian Art Academic Programme at SOAS. And it was during the course of this visit that we had discussions with the director of the National Museum of Cambodia, as well as many other museum professionals, specialists and researchers around the histories of looting and also the recent return of material to museums in the country, and in particular the return of material to the National Museum of Cambodia. And for us, that really highlighted the possibility of representing the voices and the perspectives of Cambodian museum professionals who have had experience of object restitution. Then, of course, at SOAS, there are many alumni now from the Southeast Asian Art Academic Programme who are working in the region's museums and who've become increasingly engaged with and really articulate about the issue of restitution. So we knew that they'd be very interested and be able to contribute to this publication. So the idea of the book really from the start was to have an equal representation of Southeast Asian and Western authors on the topic. And indeed, the book includes contributions from museum professionals and scholars in Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, as well as Europe and North America. The book explores the lives of ancient Hindu, Buddhist and other objects which have been repatriated from the West to museums in Southeast Asia. And I think importantly, it's the first edited volume entirely devoted to object restitution to this region of the world. The book is structured around case studies, object case studies. So there's the removal of Khmer material and recent returns of antiquities to the National Museum of Cambodia, the return of the Mandalay regalia in 1964, as well as other historic and contemporary repatriations to Myanmar, representations of Buddhist art at the Museum of Cham Sculpture in Vietnam, Bang Chang archaeological material in the US, the impact of social media on contemporary acts of restitution in Thailand, and finally the transfer of the ancient Prajma Paramita statue, as well as more recent returns from the Netherlands to Indonesia. Importantly, many of these chapters bring to light information never before published regarding the processes, the practices, and the politics of acquiring and returning Southeast Asian art. So we know that Southeast Asian countries suffered an extraordinary loss of cultural heritage over the past 150 or so years through colonialism, colonial appropriation, but more recently through looting and illicit trafficking. And this has resulted in this extensive diaspora, if you like, of archaeological and art objects now located across the world in museums and private collections. So this book fundamentally then argues for the importance and the positive impact of the process of object restitution. It sees the return of objects as a vital and always collaborative process, and it should not be simply conceptualized as loss, but reconceptualized, if you like, as gain in relation to knowledge, relationships, and understanding. So it's clear that restitution is now an extremely topical issue, and indeed it's one of the key issues facing museums, especially museums across Europe at the moment. And of course, its current high profile reflects changing global power relations and also the increasing vocal criticisms of the historic concentration of the world heritage in the museums in the West. And in particular, it was a report commissioned by President Macron in 2018, which can really be seen as a watershed, for this called for thousands of African artworks in French museums to be returned to the continent. This report paved the way for other former colonial powers to start to consider in much more detail the provenance of objects in their museum collections. So German and Dutch museums, for example, now really prioritise provenance research in relation to these problematic objects. And I think we'll be hearing more about this from Henrietta Lidchi in a moment. But there are increasing signs too that UK museums are starting to engage with these debates, especially with the recent returns and also the promises of the return of Benin material. I think it'll only be a matter of time before Southeast Asian objects become much more thoroughly researched in Western museums, and these processes of restitution start to become significantly accelerated. So finally then, before I hand over to Panggah, just on a personal note, I'd like to say just how much I've enjoyed working on this project over the last 4 or so years with Panggah and of course with other authors. In fact, I couldn't have asked for a more capable, a more dedicated, efficient co-editor than Panggah. And it's been a real privilege and pleasure also to work with Peter, Lena and Sana at NUS Press, with Ashley Thompson and Pamela Corey, who've been incredibly supportive series editors. And it's also been an incredible privilege and pleasure to work with a very talented group of scholars and authors from around the world. I wish them all every success in the future. And I'm going to hand over now to Panggah. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. To continue these introductions, first of all, I would like to thank Louise for inviting me to work on these exciting projects. It felt a bit daunting at the beginning, I must be honest, but she has been so kind and patient. So for me, working on these projects has been truly inspiring experience in so many ways. And for that matters, I would like to thank the author as well for being so open and engaging throughout the editorial process with us. That being said, in this project, we aim not only to bring in diverse authors, but also along with them a wide array of interweaving arguments as they relate to object restitutions. We did not intend the book as the authority for restitution debate in Southeast Asia, but instead we have strived to bring unsolicited chitter-chatters and unpublished research out into the opens. And by doing so, we envision the books as a platform to open as well as promote equal dialogue between museums and people in Southeast Asia, together with specialists and institutions from outside the regions. So for the convenience of our readers, we divide the book thematically into 3 parts. In the first part, the chapters discuss the issue of the issue of artifact ownerships, putting forward questions about specific legalities, interconnected actors, and most importantly, sense of ownerships, creating a particular context not only for the distributions, but also the retentions of artifacts both in colonial and post-colonial period. Particularly revealing in the chapter on Kokher sculptures, Chia Sochiat, Muang Chandratsmei, and Louise Tythacott bring in testimonies from local villagers recorded in 2012. These villagers, who either witnessed or were involved in the looting between 1970 and 2000, provide a portrait for localized context for the transnational black markets in antiquities. Meanwhile, Gabriel Aibe investigate specific actors' motivation and transactions for the trading of Khmer antiquities during the French colonial periods, and why the mechanisms originally meant to only auctions quote fragment and debris unquote ended up selling many pieces of exceptional importance. As for the case of retentions, we have Melody Rothari that describe the political environment in which the remaining Thais Banjiang material at the US Museum today is in a state of legal limbo due to ongoing investigation right now, resulted in the artifact not accessible for the public at the present. For the second part of the book, we have chapters examining issues as they relate to object biographies and colonial legacies. Various factors are considered, including perception of colonial injustice, self-determinations, national historiography, and political motive, upon which objects were returned or need to be returned. Nguyen Duyen, for example, laments the incompleteness of Don Duong display in the Museum of Cham Sculpture in Da Nang, because many of the statues had been looted and removed in the West by the beginning of the 20th century. She questioned the possibility for those statues to be displayed not only in Europe and North America, but also in Vietnam in the future. In this regard, Jos van Beurden offers invaluable insights for the context that enable the returns of objects by the Netherlands to Indonesia in the 1970s and 2010s. He demonstrates that Indonesia today is more confident and assertive in its approach to restitution, and how the Dutch proactive stand to provenance research on colonial era objects and returns is indicative of a trend set to continue. John Clark, who sadly passed away in the final editorial process of this book, in retrospect provide the processes and politics involved in the display of Burmese regalia, the South Kensington Museum, later in the V&A, that led to its unprecedented return to Myanmar in the 1964. Meanwhile, in my chapters, I look at the importance of national historiography in considering requests for object repatriations, while at the same time questioning the linkage between national heritage and restitution through the movement of Raden Saleh's paintings. And finally, in the last part of the books, we deal with questions about cultural identities and how they contribute to the call for repatriating objects. In this part, we have Pacarapon Panomphans that looks closely at the grassroots movement for advancing local and communal identities in Thailand. And for this movement, social media provide a powerful platform to democratize and bolsters the quest for repatriating and owning artifacts. On the other hand, Charlotte Galloway addresses the complexity of restitutions in relation to the cultural and political history of Myanmar. She raises an interesting considerations whether the return of physical objects is the most suitable mean of compensations when a financial donation to a pagoda may be more beneficial. So in this regard, Wieske Sapardan lays out how Indonesian government has been utilizing the Prasna Paramita statue, the best known icon of Indonesian art since its return from the Netherlands in the 1970s for promoting cultural diplomacy and international cooperation. So all things considered, the essays on these books critically examine the issue of object restitutions in relation to the particular circumstances of countries in Southeast Asia. The book highlights the diversity of values, benefits, and challenges which face cultures in the regions. Chapters shed light on subjects such as provenance history, object ownership, and identity politics. There are the issues, we believe, which will have a positive impact for Southeast Asian countries and Western museums in dealing with changing perceptions and practices of restitution in the future. Thank you. And back to you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Panggah. Well, it's my great pleasure now to introduce our first commentator, Henrietta Lidchi. Henrietta is currently curator at the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands. Her most recent book has focused on questions of colonial military collections in the United Kingdom. She served on the Dutch National Advice Committee that presented the report, Colonial Collections and a Recognition of Injustice, to the Dutch Minister of Culture, Education and Science in 2020. And she's recently co-edited a rather wonderful and impressive volume entitled Dividing the Spoils, Perspectives on Military Collecting and the British Empire, published just last year by Manchester University Press. So thank you very much, Henrietta, and over to you.
Thank you, Louise. And of course, it's a great delight to be invited to respond to the publication at its launch. It affords me the opportunity, of course, for a private view of the content, which I'm very grateful for, and for thinking through the impact of the volume alongside other commentators, Sadiah Boonstra and Tess Davis. And we sort of apportioned what we're going to say. Each of us, I think, will bring things out according to our own perspective, what we value in the volume, how it speaks to our work at this time, and also possibly to say that we've only had a short moment to delve into its content, and so obviously it's not as deep a reading as that we will do in the future. As Louise noticed and spoke eloquently about, it's self-evidently timely. It responds to our common concern with the desire to decolonize our collection, to widen the range of expertise that can speak about the historic collections in museums, that can interpret heritage, and that could chart essentially the life histories of objects as they move across spaces. In the introduction, of course, it addresses colonialism as a material practice, the appropriating nature of colonialism and its sort of relocation of objects from one part of the world to another. It also very importantly addresses that in the post-colonial period. So the political period directly after the departure of Europeans, things like the Vietnam War, moments of independence, moments of civil strife in countries themselves, and then more recently, of course, the trade in antiquity. So one of the things I value about the volume is the sweep of the range of issues, the sweep of its theorization, the understanding of heritage as kind of instrumental, as having inherent value, all of these issues that we discuss and that we know about. And by focusing on Southeast Asia, of course, it focuses on a geography, a political terrain that's had multiple European presences. And that itself creates another really valuable perspective, because as you read through the essays, you start to look at the way in which the French acted in Cambodia, the way the British acted in Burma, the way the Americans acted in Vietnam. And that gives you a sense not only of the various ways in which colonial administrations produced systems to validate, administer, and transfer objects, but how they then reconciled this in the post-colonial period. As Louise has mentioned, I have had a career that's taken me both into UK museums and to Dutch museums. I currently work at the National Museum of World Cultures, and as has been referred to, there's been quite a lot of discussion of decolonization about what is the way forward with colonial collections currently in the possession of the Dutch state and held custodian by museums. So so I was quite interested, and I was particularly interested in the essay by Jos van Beurden, contrasting it a little bit with the essay by John Clarke, which is the essay I sort of want to dwell on. So the biographies and legacies element of the book. Jos creates a very compelling and a breezy report on the various issues that are linked to Indonesian-Dutch relations, the moments in the 1970s where those relations were discussed in terms of the return of national heritage, discussions that have a very significant purchase on the report that was presented in 2020 by the Colonial Commission to the Minister of Education, Culture and Science. And the terms of that debate are questions of unconditional return, conditional return, and questions of consent. How do people consent to part with their objects, and under what conditions does consent have an importance in the discussion about return? Looting, of course, is an extreme form of the lack of consent. So surrendering under duress in conditions of violence, in conditions of military conflict. And one of the essays, as I said, that I'm most interested in, and I want to spend a tiny little bit of time on, is the essay by John Clarke, which looks at the Mandalay regalia that was looted by the British in 1885 during the Third Anglo-Burmese War. And that essay raises a whole series of things that I find particularly compelling. And I find it deeply frustrating and sad that I can't ask John Clarke the answers to the questions I have. So one of the things that John shows, and it shows slightly tacitly, is the way the British administered loot, the issue of prize committees, the way prize looted material was sold for the benefit of the paying of soldiers, but equally how in that administering of prize, and this is slightly tacit in his essay, and the thing I would have talked to him about, is the way that military commanders set aside certain portions of that loot to send back to Britain, to send back to Great Britain. And that's the regalia that ended up in the V&A for a period of years. And that's set aside and remains in possession, essentially, of the British government and over time of the India Office. So one of the conditions under which the Burmese regalia was returned back in 1964 under a Labour government through pressure not only from Burma itself, but also internal pressure in the British media, was the fact that although the V&A were the custodians, they weren't the owners. The British government retained ownership. And one of the big debates in the UK is the question about the Board of Trustees, that essentially national institutions are governed by national legislation, and therefore the government can't act in those terms. But at the time, the V&A didn't have its national legislation, which was created in 1883. That administrative fact is in fact very significant in this context. An administrative fact that also was very important in the return of the Kris of Diponegoro last year by the Dutch national government, because they used the agreement made in the 1970s to return that object. So one of the aspects I value is the sort of micro histories, the way legality and morality are entangled and argued by various parties. So John Clarke goes very thoroughly through the Foreign and Common Office records, and he reproduces the arguments that were produced at the time about the valuation of the regalia, discussions regarding the fact that the custodians of those regalia argued that it wasn't aesthetically as important to the UK as it was symbolically important to Burma. Those very arguments that we're still using, that we're still trying to deploy in order to talk about restitution. Finally, because I don't want to take up too much time, one of the things I very value about the essay is a little bit to talk about the question of loss versus the question of gain. In a way, what decolonization asks us to do is reckon with our history and reconcile ourselves to the discomforts that that gives us in order that we can produce more positive futures for these collections. And I do sincerely believe that detailed, sensitive, empathetic provenance research that really reads the colonial archive against the grain and mines it for everything it can tell us is a way in which we can actually have a good conversation about these issues. So those are a few of my thoughts.
Thank you, Andy, for the appreciation of the volume and also the insightful comments. So now it is my turn to introduce the next commentators. Dr. Sadiah Boonstra is a curator and historian working and living in Jakarta, Indonesia. She's currently researching Indonesian perspective on restitution issue from the colonial times to the present. In the past, her PhD research focuses on the dynamics of heritage formation in Indonesia from colonial times to the present, with wayang as a case study. Previously, Sadiah was Asia Scholar at Melbourne University as well as a curator public program Asiatopa Melbourne. She already curated a number of exhibitions, among which at Framer Frame Amsterdam, Galerie Nasional in Jakarta, Tropen Museum Amsterdam, and also worked on the wayang exhibitions at the British Museum London in 2016. So, Sadiah, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Panggah, for this lovely introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. So first of all, actually, congratulations to you, Panggah, but also to Louise and all of the other authors with the launch of the book, and also to everyone involved at NUS Press, of course, as well. As Panggah mentioned, I live and work in Jakarta, and as such, I am speaking as an inhabitant of the Global South, but one who is privileged enough to have lived experience in the Global North as well. So I straddle the worlds of the former colonizer, the Netherlands, and the former colonized, Indonesia. I've also had the privilege and pleasure of working with and researching colonial collections from Indonesia at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam and at the British Museum in London. So it is a great honor and very exciting for me to be part of these important discussions about restitution. One of the main questions that the authors posed triggered me in particular, and that was how to decolonize the curriculum, the museum, the university, so basically how to decolonize our knowledge, while at the same time, these institutions are at the heart of structures of coloniality, the very structures that we are trying to dismantle. So while I was reading the book, this is actually the tension that resonates throughout the contributions. And I would like to take the opportunity here to reflect a little bit more on that. For this, I'm inspired by the sociologist school of decolonial thought, and I will take a decolonial perspective, which is at large about unlearning coloniality and an epistemic reconstitution of learning and being. So to me, what seems to be at the heart of discussions around the restitution of objects, either colonial or looted, is the notion of historical injustice and the ethical question of how to deal with these legacies today. Issues of returning cultural objects are locally and historically specific and, in my view, largely ethical issues, but they often do require a political and diplomatic answer. The conscious choice of the authors to include Southeast Asian perspectives is crucial, as it gives us a clear sense of the localized and historically specific situations and urgencies of each case. To decolonize the curriculum, the museum, the university, we need more of those local perspectives, knowledges, and experiences. To give you an example, the chapter on the looting of the Kokor site in Cambodia involves discussions with local inhabitants of the site. To me, it was really striking to read that all of them remember the looted temple statues. Reading through the testimonies was truly heartbreaking at some times, but it also highlighted the fact that there is so much knowledge present in the local community. What also struck me throughout the book is that even though restitution issues are highly localized and specific, the historical context of Southeast Asia as a region is that of colonialism, as well as the geopolitics of the Cold War. These two contexts provide the backdrop for colonial collecting and for much of the looting that happened throughout the 20th century. As Henrietta already pointed out, colonialism had many different European phases in the region, each with different effects in different places. But overall, coloniality viewed the people and cultural objects in Southeast Asia from a very particular Eurocentric perspective. And the museum was actually one of those institutions through which this worldview was constructed and communicated. And that this clashes with local religious and spiritual values and knowledges becomes clear from Nguyen's article on the exhibition of Cham sculptures at the Da Nang Museum in Vietnam. She describes how the sculptures are presented in a decontextualized way that fail to acknowledge the sacred values. Wieske Sapardan, in her article on the restitution of the Prajnaparamita in Indonesia, similarly describes the decontextualization of the statue. It was first taken away from its site at the Singosari Temple in East Java, subsequently exhibited in the Netherlands, and then finally returned to Indonesia in the 1970s, where it is now on show at the National Museum in Jakarta. The object biographies of the Cham sculptures and Prajnaparamita showed that decontextualization starts with the removal of the statues from their original sites. Placing an object in a museum is always an act of decontextualization, and it transforms an object created for a specific context into an object in a museum. The colonial moment in which this removal happened, the so-called moment of discovery, adds a problematic layer to this. And this brings me to the issue of sources. The contributions in the book partly rely on sources produced in colonial times, since this was often the first time that some of these objects started to be documented in writing. So one of the questions is, how should we handle colonial sources in our attempt to decolonize the museum, the university, and our knowledge? How can we fill the gaps in these sources and relink to local knowledges existent before colonialism? One way would be to listen deeply to colonial silences of these sources to fill these gaps in our knowledge. And vice versa, speaking from the Global South, we need access to that what already exists. We need access to historical sources, to documents, books, objects, actually anything that can help us to research, write, and rewrite history from a decolonial perspective. The last point that I want to make today concerns the nation state, which plays an important role in all contributions. For example, Panggah, Ardiyansyah, and Sapardan point out that the nation state and national identity building continue to be the dominant frameworks for restitution issues in Indonesia. Ardiyansyah shows how the restitution of Raden Saleh's painting, The Arrest of Diponegoro, was framed in a national context in the 1970s. This then led to the consolidation of Raden Saleh as the founding father of Indonesian painting in the 2000s, while previously his status of national hero was more contested. Sapardan offers insight into how the Indonesian nation-state used the restitution of the Prashna Paramita for cultural diplomacy and international cooperation. Both of these examples illustrate that when the return of objects is framed as cultural heritage, it invariably becomes a stake in Indonesian identity building and nationalism. But Jos van Beurden wonders how much longer the Indonesian government is able to maintain this dominant role in restitution discussions. In the contribution by Pacharafon Panomven writes about the influence of netizens in Thailand and provides a glimpse of what might happen, as in Indonesia, social media platforms are highly influential too. He notes that social media restitution activists contribute to educating the public about restitution issues, but simultaneously hamper processes of restitutions in Thailand. Time will tell what will happen here in the Indonesian situation, but there is a growing awareness and engagement with restitution issues, and the Indonesian government is becoming more proactive in restitution matters as well. This will likely lead to a growing complexity of domestic politics and issues of ownerships. And there will be many other complex issues to be dealt with, but it is certain that restitution issues are firmly on the agenda these days. So thank you, Louise, Panggah, and all of the other authors for your insightful work. Congratulations again, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sadiah, for a very thoughtful and considered commentary. And I'm sure we can start the discussion after Tess's presentation with some of the things that you've raised. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our third and final commentator today, Tess Davis. Tess is a lawyer, an archaeologist by training, and she's executive director of the Antiquities Coalition. Tess oversees the organisation's work to fight cultural racketeering worldwide, as well as its award-winning think tank in Washington. She's been a legal consultant for the US and foreign governments and works with both the art world and law enforcement to keep looted antiquities off the market. She writes and speaks widely on these issues, having published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Foreign Policy, and also in top scholarly journals. And she's also featured in documentaries in America and Europe. Tess is admitted to the New York State Bar. She teaches cultural heritage law at Johns Hopkins University, and she's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 2015, the royal government of Cambodia, in fact, knighted Tess for her work to recover the country's plundered treasures. Over to you, Tess. Looking forward to hearing your commentary.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. And I would just like to begin by commending the editors and authors of the published work that we're celebrating today, Returning Southeast Asia's Past, Objects, Museums, and Restitution. And this volume may be the first that's dedicated exclusively to its subject, but I doubt it will be the last, as its pages demonstrate very well the repatriation of stolen cultural treasures to Asia and the Pacific region is increasingly a discussion that's taking place not just in the world's cultural institutions, but at the highest levels of government. It's prompted strong statements and strong actions from heads of state and government, such as Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen, China's President Xi Jinping, and Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison. So it's really a matter that cuts across foreign relations, national economies, and of course, culture, which is so central to all of our identities. And I also wanted to thank the organizers of this event today for including our organization, the Antiquities Coalition, in this important discussion alongside so many leading voices, literally from around the world. Our organization is based in Washington, D.C., and it's dedicated to combating the illicit trade in art and antiquities, as well as to recovering and returning stolen cultural treasures to their rightful owners. Now, of course, as everyone well knows, including those who would read this volume, as long as there have been tombs, there have been tomb raiders, and certainly as long as there have been civilizations, there have been enemy armies bent on plundering them. But in the modern world, this destruction is continuing to take place at a scale that's really never before seen in history, driven by this multi-billion-dollar art market. And the United States still makes up the majority, the largest percentage of that global art market, licit and unfortunately illicit, which our organization believes gives the United States not only an opportunity to act, but a responsibility to do so. So we created the Antiquities Coalition to fight back against this transnational crime. And our organization, our focus is really working to build and also to channel political will to combat cultural racketeering. And we do this in partnership with governments, with law enforcement, with the art market, and the public, in the hopes of really ensuring that our past is preserved for the next generation. And we also try to support, in fact, our main purpose, I would say, is to support the efforts of the communities and even the countries who are leading these efforts around the world. And as it so happens, those tend to be groups, areas of the world that are suffering from crisis, often armed conflict, often violent extremism. Countries today, such as Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. However, as this book makes clear, the tragedy that's happening to those nations I just listed today, it's of course happened before. And that's one reason why this volume is so important, because I really felt in looking through it and reading it, and it's just arrived, so I look forward to reading it in more detail. But the stories it tells are important not just as scholarship, but also as lessons for how the international community should respond to today's cultural crises, as well as a stark warning for what will happen if we don't. Indeed, as we all know, just a generation ago, the world's global hotspot was not the Middle East and North Africa, which is the location of so many of the worst armed conflicts today, but the countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in Cambodia, which has been the focus of so much of my work, and also features so heavily in this book, as everyone well knows, fighting erupted between government forces and the Khmer Rouge in 1970 and was followed by decades of civil war, genocide, and foreign occupation that ended only with the death of Pol Pot and subsequent surrender of his remaining forces. And as we've seen, as we are continuing to see throughout the Arab Spring and its aftermath, the Cambodian Civil War triggered organized looting and trafficking, which in turn worked to further bankroll and thus continue the violence. And few of the country's temples, not even the famous Angkor Wat, and of course, as this book details so well, the former capital of Kokir as well, were spared from these war profiteers. And as we're also seeing today, this cultural looting and trafficking went hand in hand with the deliberate and systematic destruction of targeted groups and their heritage, which has been a hallmark of genocides throughout the 20th century, which aims to eliminate not only a people, but all evidence of them. And of course, the cost of this atrocity crime were very high in Cambodia. The figures I have read state that 130 Cham mosques were destroyed, all 73 Catholic churches, and well over 3,000 contemporary Buddhist temples, along with sacred literature, statues, all of these things that will never be able to be replaced. And while this organized looting and trafficking, while this cultural destruction began a half a century ago now, it's of course taken Cambodia decades to rebuild and recover a small part of what was lost. But I think a strong message that comes out in this book, and the one that I really wanted to highlight today, is rebuild and recover it has. Indeed, just this January, the royal government of Cambodia announced that they were welcoming home over 100 masterpieces from the collection of Douglas Latchford, an indicted antiquities trafficker who died last year in Thailand fighting extradition to the United States for multiple felonies. And this is one of the largest recoveries of stolen art since World War II. In fact, I've only been able to find one recovery that has surpassed it in terms of number. And Cambodia is to be commended for graciously accepting this return and congratulated for its victories. And it's a story that I hope the authors and editors of this volume will be able to tell in a future edition or sequel. But until then, the stories that are told here of Cambodia's successes and of other successes throughout Southeast Asia, they remain as powerful testaments. As I mentioned earlier, our organization works very closely with governments who are facing some of the worst challenges of the 20th century: conflict, terrorism, crime. And I've seen firsthand the inspiration that Southeast Asia's successes provide to these governments and to the people who live in these countries who are working to recover from the situations they're into now. That Cambodia, with its rich culture and its history battered but unbroken, was able to not only survive one of the worst conflicts of the 20th century, but to come back stronger than ever. And that today it's bringing home its stolen treasures at a huge rate. That really gives such a message of hope to the communities and countries with which we work. And again, I'm so thankful to the authors and to the editors for sharing this story, because again, it's a source of inspiration and it's an important lesson to the other governments with which we work. And thank you. And I look very forward to the discussion. And again, thank you for allowing me to be a part of it today.
Thank you, Tess, for the warm comments and also for highlighting the impacts of the illicit traffickings, both in Cambodia and also in other regions in Southeast Asia. So just kind of to kickstart the discussion, of course, and also to offer a first response to some of the issues that brought up by the commentators, I would like to start by highlighting the issues brought by Sadiah. She mentioned about what is localized perspective or local perspective, or maybe it better we term it as localized perspective, and what do we mean by it, and how we reconcile with the perspective from within Southeast Asia. And to kind of answer this, I think it's better for us to have it or to understand it in more discursive term, or probably also to allude to her comment on the colonial lens or the colonial perspective on what kind of thing that we can brought up from the discussion of project restitution. So in looking at a localist perspective, of course, we need to be discursive, both from the country and also from outside the country, also from the time, post-colonial, colonial. We cannot actually, I don't know, Sadiah mentioned about how we can unlearn the colonial knowledge, but I don't know if we can do that actually, because it's already conflated, it's already confused one with others. But it's also important for us to aware of that, so that we can understand the perspective from Southeast Asia, for example, from Indonesia. When we discuss Indonesia, for example, it's the importance of Diponegoro in the discussion is really, the discussion of restitution is really apparent. We have Indonesia already have a written object belonging to Diponegoro, like the staff, the saddle, even the saddle and the kris recently. So how do then we reconcile with the importance of Diponegoro? The one way to understand that is to understand also the way in which Diponegoro was framed actually during the colonial time, during the knowledge built by the colonial power at the time, alluding to Diponegoro as an example of treachery, as an example of a war that bring chaos to the colony, and by that Indonesia then take it up and then just switch the gear, or switch the black into white, and saying that, oh yes, Diponegoro is one of the great hero of Indonesia. So that's why Diponegoro becomes so important now in the historiography of Indonesia, and it's also very much relevant with the situation today. Even if we heard about or we read about the comment or the statement from the Director General of Culture of Indonesia, Ilma Farid, that now Indonesia is taking more active stance on repatriation issue, particularly with object in the Europe, particularly in the Netherlands as well. In one of the newspaper interview, he stated that Indonesia will focus on objects that closely related to national identity, and so that's why we know that Diponegoro is one of them. So there's particularly feelings on the process, the way in which countries in Southeast Asia trying to find out objects, or to frame the object and frame the call for restitution for the objects now lies in the West, in the North America, or in the Europe. Of course, it's not particularly in the same way with the countries other than Indonesia, but similar process we can observe as well, such as the Burmese regalia that are being valued as important objects in the history of independent past of Myanmar before colonized by British. This kind of discursive lens is also important for us to also understand what is it about, how to understand the global the black market antiquities in Southeast Asia as well, because by using this discursive lens, we also need to see Southeast Asia not only merely as a victim of global antiquities trades, but also people in Southeast Asia has been active in promoting, in supporting these global art markets, so to speak, and also even like creating a new submarket like the internet markets that we also see in blooming in Thailand as well. So this is the kind of thing that I think we need to realize, we need to be aware of when we are discussing about how do we frame the local perspective in Southeast Asia. Okay, I'm running out of time, I guess. So that's it from now. From me. But I think I can call Wieske probably to add something about the context of Indonesia. Wieske.
Thank you, Mas. Thank you, Mas Panggah. First of all, I would like to thank Louise and also Panggah for giving me the opportunity as contributor to this publication. I really appreciate their patience and guidance throughout the process. I would also like to thank Ashley and Pamela for their valuable input as series editors, and to the NUS Press. As Panggah already mentioned, the chapter I wrote focused primarily on one object, the Prajna Paramita statue, and how the repatriation of this statue from the Netherlands to Indonesia contributed to promoting cultural diplomacy and international cooperation. Referring to the work of other scholars, Jos van Beurden and Cynthia Scott, the chapter highlighted how the transfer of these objects in the 1970s can be understood as a gesture of goodwill of the Netherlands in the response to the request from the Indonesian authorities for the return of cultural heritage objects that was collected during the colonial periods. The repatriation of the statue was a result of some 30 years of bilateral negotiation between the newly independent nation state of Indonesia with its former colonizing country. And to follow up on Sadiah's comment on the colonial perspective, I would like to add that the cultural cooperation between the Netherlands and Indonesia following the transfer in the 1970s, particularly involving the National Museum of Indonesia and the Rijksmuseum for Volkenkunde, has been positive in promoting mutual understanding and appreciation of each other's history and also collection. It has done by making cultural heritage objects and archive available for study and exhibitions in the other country. In this publication, I also highlighted some Dutch-Indonesian joint exhibitions in which the Prajna Paramita statue was displayed. And I also second Sadiah's comment that more works needs to be done to fill the knowledge gap created by colonialism. And I think this can be done by continuing to research the provenance of museum collections from the former colonies and to increase international cooperation. And lastly, being an Indonesian, I am grateful to be given the opportunity to write about my perspective on how the values and meaning of one object shifted throughout its life, how it was presented and valued in the Netherlands before it's transferred to Indonesia, and what the object means to Indonesia, especially in the context of building national identity. Thank you. Over to you, Mas Panggah.
Thank you, Mbak Wieske. Louise, you have any further thoughts?
Thank you, Panggah and Wieske, very much. Just a few thoughts. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to Henrietta, Sadiah and Tess for your really wonderful, thoughtful, supportive commentary and reflections on the book. We appreciate you've only just received your copy, so it's extraordinary how quickly you've digested and considered the various chapters. So thank you very much indeed for that. I just want to pick up briefly on a couple of things. First of all, Henrietta said, then I'll move briefly to Tess and then turn to Sadiah and invite Wieske to join in the discussion. In terms of Henrietta's commentary, absolutely support and agree with highlighting, I suppose, John Clarke's chapter and particularly the significance of these micro-histories that you talked about and the detailed research, understanding, excuse me, of archives, I think is incredibly important. So you talked about, this empathetic provenance research and reading colonialism against the archive. I think Sadiah also talked about the importance of archive and archival research. And I think this is going to be extremely important for the future. And indeed, we're already seeing across the UK, across Europe, that many museums are now creating dedicated posts for provenance researchers. And I think this kind of work is only going to increase and has to increase in the future. And linked to that, of course, is the importance of developing documentation, databases, and sharing information between institutions and between researchers. In terms of Tess's really thought-provoking and interesting commentary, again, it's so important to highlight the impact of illicit trafficking, particularly in the Cambodian context. I very much appreciated your discussion of Latchford and also the kind of things that you've written in the past about Latchford and Latchford's collection, and this interesting future fact that 100 or so masterpieces from Latchford's collection are going to be returned to Cambodia. And what you mentioned about a possible sequel to the book got me very excited because, of course, this is such a dynamic and topical area that it's very obvious that there could be many more case studies and stories around returned material in the future. So I think Cambodia in particular is an area to really focus on and keep an eye on. And then finally, Sadiah, again, thank you so much for your contributions, very wide-ranging, very important discussions around, how to handle colonial sources, I was struck particularly by the way you described both Wieske and Duyen's chapters and this tension with this process of decontextualizing in museums and the emphasis on aesthetic approaches in terms of decontextualization and not looking at local or religious forms. And perhaps this is a good opportunity to invite Duyen Nguyen, who is a PhD researcher at SOAS, to perhaps say a little bit more about her really important chapter on the processes and practices at the Cham Museum, because you're not just a PhD researcher at SOAS, you also will have been a curator at the Cham Museum. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Louise, for inviting me, and thanks, Ada, for allowing me the chance to contribute a chapter to this very interesting book. Yeah, I want to thank Sadiah for your comments on the chapter on the Duyen Buddhist Gallery that I contributed to this book. You mentioned about the issues of decontextualization, and actually this is the main focus of my chapter. It is the fact that the Cham Museum today display a lot of sculptures of the Cham people. However, when we look around the galleries, we see a lot of gaps, and some objects are now belong to the collection of other museums around the world, and that's why we see the gaps. And many objects were taken out of Vietnam during the colonial period, and today there are many holes in the way we display the objects, and sometimes with the lack of many interpretation means we cannot fully understand the meanings of the objects, or we cannot understand fully the whole landscape of Chamba sculpture as well. And the issue of decontextualization is something very urgent that we need to address. Yeah, so that's what I agree with Sadiah, and Sadiah also mentioned how we can fill in the gaps. Yeah, and in my essay about the display of Chamba sculpture, especially the Buddhist sculpture at the Duyen Buddhist Gallery of the Cham Museum, I also raised questions. So I think, like, to fill in the gaps, we need a cooperation between the Cham Museum in particular and other museums as well, with other institutions in US and in European countries. Yeah, we need to work together for object provenance, and this also requires a willingness from other institutions from European countries as well. And we also need to have access to some archival centers, especially in European countries. Yeah, so, and the other thing is we have to raise the awareness of the public as well. And in this book, there is a chapter written about using social media to raise the awareness of the public on this issue of restitution. Just a few days before this book launch, I watched something on Facebook, and I know that many people in Vietnam now are talking about the issue of repatriation. So I agree that social media is also a very powerful tool for us to raise the awareness of repatriation of cultural properties. Yeah, so.
Thank you very much, Duyen, for that. I believe we're now going to move on to Peter, who's going to coordinate the Q&A with the audience.
Thanks very much, Louise. Thanks, everyone. I think we've established in this discussion that the dialogue around restitution is indeed a very rich one and can work in many different ways. We do have a few questions coming from our online audience. some very broad questions addressed to all of you, some more specific questions. I think I'll start. I'll start with the two broad questions. Wim Manuhutu asks us if you've had a chance to reflect on this question of, the museum is a Western model of managing heritage, and whether it's useful in other contexts. And I guess that would also then be related to what context objects will be in when they are returned. So a very broad question, but I think I encourage anyone who'd like to tackle that.
Perhaps I'll just say something very briefly about the issue of return, because of course it's not always straightforward when material does go back to the country. It's not always clear, I suppose, where objects fundamentally belong or should belong, who are the rightful owners who can represent the objects. Thinking of the Coquet example in our edited book, it would be extremely difficult, obviously, to return those wonderful statues to the pedestals in the jungles in Coquet. It's just not feasible. So a lot of material ends up going back to the Western space, the museum, often to the National Museum. So you have these Coquet sculptures now in Phnom Penh, miles away from Coquet, which is in the north of Cambodia. And yes, it's the whole issue of what happens to objects and who rightfully should represent. So yes, it's not an easy process. The whole issue once something has been returned, and there is a tendency, as with material in Mexico, in many other countries, to simply return an object to a national museum in that country, where once again it's completely decontextualized and dislocated from the local meanings and the local environment.
I think that's something for the questions, to answer the question, I guess. By seeing the model of museums now in Southeast Asia, or particularly Indonesia, where I'm familiar of, I guess the Western model will still be considered as the best model now to how to handle things and how to present things. But it's also ongoing discussion now. I mean, I can mention the book by Christina Krebs, already mentioning about the indigenous spreading. She did very thorough, very enlightening fieldwork in Borneo and Kalimantan, and how the museum then incorporate the indigenous practice. So basically, the objects in the museums are objects in the museums, but then when there are rituals, when there are festivals, they were taken out of the museum and then become a ritual object as well. And I think this kind of appropriation as well, we can say so, also happening in Cambodia as well. I mean, in the National Museum of Phnom Penh, people are invited to come in and then to pray, to worship the statue as well. So I guess it's also still ongoing discussions now, and I think we are trying to find the right balance between Western, if we can say if it's Western or it's Eastern, but the best way to how to then present this in the museum in Southeast Asia.
Would any of the commentators like to weigh in on that as well? Henrietta, perhaps?
Okay, I suppose it was just a reflection about the fact that obviously museums are a Western model, and they were often imported either during the colonial period or during the modern period. So in a way, they are replaying certain relationships and certain performances around objects. And that provides some comfort, I would say, to Western states when they return things. And I think prior to the most recent period, there was a lot of, well, at least there were some conditions about objects being returned and kept in similar ways and preserved in similar ways. And I think that as our discussion moves on and the principle of repatriation is accepted, I think it's still in a context where foreign officers are doing that negotiation, and therefore states are doing the negotiations. And at this moment in time, there is a greater comfort in a political context with a similar model, but that obviously, I think, will shift and has shifted to an extent, as Panggah has said, because that's one of the particularities about the Indonesian case is the strength of the museum as a sort of colonial construct, then handed to the Indonesian government taking it over, and therefore the quality of collections in the museum versus a lot of the African museums or museums created in African countries which are post-colonial, and that accounts for different museum concepts around different parts of the world, which I don't think is, that's the other book that maybe Louise and Panggah can edit about museology. That's all I want to say.
Sadiah, if I can ask you to also respond, because I think this question is related to your comments, but let me just add another question, another twist to this, which came from Yus Brusma, who was saying that, of course, not only are objects removed, but also often knowledge is removed, right? Epistemic violence, or what Hussein Alatas called intellectual imperialism already many years ago. So how does that also complicate this story of return? Sadiah, I think we need you to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
There.
So
it's got to happen once every session.
Yeah, exactly. So this time it's me. I was trying to sort of like touch on that issue through my comments on Duyen's and Wieske's contributions, as I agree with Panggah and Henrietta. Obviously, the museum is a Western model that has been imported to the Southeast Asian region, and what is happening now is that you see that there's a struggle going on, that the current society, for example, Indonesia, it struggles with what kind of place the museum should have in society, because the values that are embedded in the museum and the worldview that is embedded in the museum clashes with how locally, traditionally, people have dealt with objects. So it's a totally different context. So that is where kind of like the tension comes from. And I do think that in this process of decontextualizing and taking away, removing objects from the original context, of course, it also results in taking away knowledge and everything, the whole context of knowledge, in which it is embedded, that changes, and that cannot be recovered. Because it already has changed. So even when an object comes back, it doesn't come back to the same context. It doesn't come back to the same environment. And then the emergence of the new nation states, of course, complicates that again, because now it comes back within the framework of a nation state. But right. What does that do to the relations with, for example, individuals, communities? The staff of Diponegoro that was returned, it's going back to the nation state of Indonesia. It ends up in the National Museum, but not with the family. If you would give it back to the family, to whom would you give it? There are so many generations of different families. So these are the complex, the moments in which objects have been removed, and the context of that time is vastly different from what it is today.
We're up to, thank you very much, Sadiah. I think we're just beginning, unfortunately, a very rich discussion. We have a question also now from Stephen Murphy about forgeries and how the question of forgeries fit into this. But I'm afraid we're up to about an hour and 15. So I'm going to have to postpone that discussion for another time period. The questions will be on the chat on Facebook and YouTube. And perhaps we can give some thoughts there so that people watching after the live version of this event will have a chance to answer some of those questions. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I thank you everybody for your generosity and your time and spirit in this. what I wanted to do now was really just remind everyone that this is actually just the first book in a series that NUS Press is publishing, driven by SOAS and the Southeast Asian Art and Archaeology program. And we have with us the editors of that series, and I'd like to ask them to say a few words about the series. So let me introduce to you Ashley Thompson. She's the Hiram Woodward Chair in Art at SOAS University of London, and also Pamela and Nguyen Corey, recently of SOAS and now in Vietnam at the Fulbright University. We have one more book coming later this year. It'll be announced very soon by NUS Press when we announce our fall catalog, and that's a book that brings together new perspectives on the early years of the Theravada in Cambodia, and that's edited by Ashley. So over to you, Pam and Ashley.
So I'll start off here. First of all, apologies to Stephen, because the elephant in the room certainly does need to be discussed, but we will have more discussions. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Panggah and Louise, for having the vision, the determination, and the skills, importantly, to bring this book into existence. Deep thanks also to the authors who are amongst us, if invisible to us today. You've given of your time and your thinking, and in many cases, I think you've given of your hearts to the volume. Also to our three commentators today, you've enriched the discussions already, so thank you for that. I would like also to have a thought for John Clark, to join all of you in doing so, who passed away as the book was in press, and also to our colleagues in Burma who are unable to join us today, who would have enjoyed certainly thinking about the questions that are raised in the book around restitution in Myanmar. As Peter mentioned, Returning Southeast Asia's Past is the first volume in a new series that Pamela and I co-edit. The series is titled Southeast Asian Art and Archaeology, Hindu-Buddhist Traditions. It's a collaboration between SOAS's Southeast Asian Art academic program and NUS Press under Peter Schoppert's very able leadership. Together, I think we have a very ambitious vision for the series. It is to support critically rigorous work on this very specialized field, to bridge what can appear to be gaps between, shall we say, today's iterations of the venerable lineage of Orientalist publishing, most prominent in Europe, but certainly not limited to any geographic region. Secondly, to the more theoretically driven university press world dominated by North America. And third, and very importantly, to bridge to the multiple plurilingual art and archaeology publishing worlds of Southeast Asia. NUS Press was for us a very obvious partner in this endeavor. This is not simply because the press is situated physically in Singapore. Another way of thinking about that is that the situation of NUS Press is not simple. Is it Singaporean, one could ask? Yes. Is it Southeast Asian? Yes. Can its Britishness be denied? And what is the part of the US in its constitution and its comportment? Likewise, the physical situation of SOAS's Southeast Asian Art academic program in London belies many dimensions of its true self, in my view. There are certainly days when I speak more Khmer at SOAS than I have when slogging through international meetings in Phnom Penh. I've lived and worked in Britain for more than 2 decades, but it took the pandemic with its series of lockdowns cutting us off from our immediate real social worlds to make me feel the sort of yearning for which it can be transformed into a sense of belonging to a place. We share within NUS Press a deep commitment to understanding the complex histories and cultures of Southeast Asia from within, but without erecting false borders, making reductive insides on the one hand and outsides on the other. The project requires constantly gathering the forces of very many people to build fluency in languages, Thai or Indonesian, Mandarin, English or French, as well as fluency in cultures, Khmer or Vietnamese, 9th century maritime, 12th century mainland, etc., but also across academic and national and traditional disciplinary boundaries. Because it's very important to think that to understand Southeast Asian Hindu-Buddhist art and archaeology, we also need philologists, we need religious studies experts, we need anthropologists, we need geographers, in addition to our art historians and archaeologists. We need critical thinkers able to recognize and to reach out across boundaries. We are certainly not sure we can achieve our ambitions with this series. I can say, however, that this first book in the series sets us on track. Restitution is a pressing topic in the field of Southeast Asian Hindu-Buddhist art and archaeology. I was interested to hear our commentators reflect on the fact that restitution, that the looting in Southeast Asian art and archaeology is something of the 20th century. The looting issue is something of a 20th century issue. It's already historical. Restitution is not historical for Southeast Asia. It is happening now. It is very topical. It's a topic which has art history and archaeology at its core, but it requires transdisciplinary and transnational research. I think that's been obvious in the comments today. It's a topic also which requires us, all of us, wherever we come from, and wherever we find ourselves today, to query the very foundations of our field, to query the ways and the means of historical knowledge production on Southeast Asian art and archaeology. It's a research topic which, in a very performative manner, brings into being the ways and means by which we might work to create a more just and more sound future playing field. Before I turn you over to Pamela Corey, my co-editor, who will give us a further word and a last word on the series and on the book, allow me also a last word of thanks to our all-important funders, the Alphawood Foundation of Chicago, which supports the SOAS Southeast Asian Art academic program, and so the SOAS part of this collaborative endeavor. So thank you all very much. I'll pass the screen, as it were, to Pamela.
All right, thank you so much, Ashley. So I thought that I would conclude our brief comments as the series editors by reading this passage from the introduction written by the book's co-editors, Louise and Panggah. The drive for object repatriation, which can be regarded as another form of collecting practice, might stem from the structure through which a nation and its peoples are made to experience the material embodiment of the often notably majestic past. As such, the visual manifestation, in the form of archaeological sites and artifacts, serves as a shared repertoire of image and objects that shape memory and identity. Furthermore, individuals are encouraged to seek closer physical engagement with visual and material representations, such as architecture, monuments, and the landscape, in order to experience and stimulate personal connections that respectively generate national sentiments and emotional attachment to the national collective memory. Thus, in this context, the historiography and genealogy of a nation play an important role in decisions to repatriate or not. End quote. So this passage beautifully addresses the book's appeal to deeper understandings of how objects from the past enter our present as art or heritage or patrimony through deliberately crafted frames that support established narratives of history, geography, and identity, particularly as they relate to a sense of national belonging. This is a fundamental inquiry that we believe supports the decolonial project, in which critical historiography and disciplinary self-reflexivity make us aware of the academic and structural armatures that have shaped our sense of who we are as knowledge producers and of our place and role within larger ecologies of knowledge production and dissemination. As such, the series is particularly interested in scholarship that investigates in analytical and creative ways new topics in Hindu-Buddhist art and archaeology in Southeast Asia, and that is furthermore attuned to current disciplinary and interdisciplinary questions that engage with these issues today. Decolonizing art history also means, for us, to better understand how artistic forms have acted from, in, and upon history, both within their time, but also within our time. This is an emphasis I've placed in my own teaching and my collaborative teaching, both at SOAS in London and now at Fulbright University Vietnam in Ho Chi Minh City. To even begin to pursue these inquiries, I echo what Ashley called for, which is a form of professional, intellectual, and social praxis of collaboration and multivocality across disciplinary, geographical, and linguistic boundaries. We hope for the series to at least serve as a site of germination for some of these endeavors. And before I turn this over to Peter to conclude the launch, I just wanted to express our deepest thanks to Sana Suresh for her work in organizing this event. She's done an amazing job of choreographing all the bits and pieces through what seems to me, at least, to be fairly daunting technology. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Peter.
There have been a lot of thank yous this evening, but let me add just one more. Thank you from NUS Press for your kind support, the opportunity to work with you on this series, and also with the wonderful group of scholars who are assembled as our board of editors and advisors for this series as well. So that brings us to a conclusion. But before we go, we have a few things to do. The first is I'd like to remind you of a special discount code which can be used to buy the book on the NUS Press website, or if you're in North America, on the University of Chicago Press website. If you're between Southeast Asia and North America, I think you'll have to do some comparison shopping, if you would like to get the discount. But the book will also be available from the usual online sources in many of the best bookshops in the region. So there it is. We'll flash it again at the end of the session for you if you missed it. So now it's time for the group photo. Come, everyone, gather round. Let's see how this looks. Okay, everybody's coming in. Put out that cigarette, come along. Okay, so everyone. Yeah, if you've got the book, hold it up. That'd be wonderful. All right, everybody. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, one more time. 1, 2, 3, cheers. Great. Okay, thanks, everyone. See you later. Good night. Bye. Zoom hands.